This morning I feel that we should kind of have a view the different wazifas, and I think that we should keep in mind Dul Jalal wal Ikram and his consort Hanun Jamil wal Ikram, which I like to epitomize as the two archangels. And I think that we also have to keep in mind what relevance the different features of this double being have to ourselves. So I think one could say that the different wazifas represent the different aspects of this double being. And maybe this is also what the Sephirotic tree in the Kabbalah does. It is representing the different qualities of the one and only being. And at some point, well, there's not much time remaining. We will, perhaps this afternoon, we can go into making a bridge between the Zikr and the Sephiroth of the Kabbalah, and also some of the Christian meditations. So for the moment, it all starts by our aptitude to perceive, how can you say, the manifestation of the divine being. So when we say the manifestation, we're not talking about just intelligence and spirit. That is something that is really amorphous. But we're talking about the way that this original unity begins to break out in a multiplicity of many splendid aspects, let's say, that will eventually, of course, manifest as forms. Can visualize with our creative imagination, that is, drawing somehow this picture into concreteness, is, of course, thinking in terms of features, of faces, of bodies, for a form. And what we have to do all the time is, of course, keep aware of the fact that the form is a limitation of what the Dul or the Hanun really is, beyond his or her manifestation in form. In other words, we have to always keep on reaching up to the level of pure splendor beyond all form, and even relate that to the higher, the top of this whole pyramid. Now we're thinking of the pyramid with the apex up, which is, as I say, pure intelligence, pure spirit, and pure ecstasy. Okay, so now what are those features of the being of splendor that we are able to sense, to grasp? I think the answer to that is to be found in a story which is you can find in an apocryph testament. You know that there were many more testaments than those that were incorporated officially in the New Testament. And there was the Council of Trente, I think, and then there was the Council of Nicaea. And in those councils, they weeded out a lot of Gospels which they felt were not authentic or that did not fit into the policy of the church. And some of them have been published since, recently, and one of them is, of course, the Acts of St. Peter. It's a very wonderful document which perhaps you might read at some time. And it is, they say that, you know how the disciple of Christ had a vision of Christ transfigured on Mount Tabor. So many years later, I suppose, St. Peter was still in Rome. St. Peter, the Acts of St. Peter. Anyway, this is the story, and that is that he took the disciples to the top of the Mount Tabor. In fact, I climbed the Mount Tabor myself once, and with the hope of being able to recapture that vision of the transfigured Christ. And nobody could see anything. And so then he said, look with the eyes of your soul, not just with your physical eyes. And then everyone saw something, but what they saw was very different. One saw Christ as a baby, one saw Christ as the child preaching in the temple, one saw Christ as he was on the top of the Mount of Olives, the one saw Christ resurrected. Everyone saw Christ in a different fashion. And so they began to wonder whether it was not just their imagination, and they weren't really seeing Christ, but they were just fantasizing. And then St. Peter said, I remember this in Latin, talem eum vidi qualem potui. Each one of them saw, vidi, as much talem, you see, as potui as they could. Each one saw according to a capacity of seeing. It's like in a red vase, the water will appear red, and a blue one, it will appear blue. That's the capacity. According to the capacity, the splendor of the cosmic Christ will appear in different forms. So don't go by the form. That is your capacity. That's what you offer. Like your creative imagination offers a capacity. But lo and behold, what comes through that capacity is the real thing. And so when I speak about trying to glean something of the features of the being of splendor, then of course we're going to project before our mind's eye, some tangible, concrete representation of what this being could be like. And then, since we are endowed with the faculty of always being able to, to conceive of infinity, let's say the infinity of perfection, we're always going to maximize it. In fact, majorize it, infinitize it. For example, one could say, it's a being whose radiance is stronger than 10,000 suns. And another would say, well, no, not 10,000, 100,000. And it really doesn't matter. It's just that the comparison, like between anything that is within our middle range, is so enormous. And so, of course, one is overwhelmed by the tremendum. That's a word that is used by the Gnostics a lot. Tremendum. It's a word that was used by the Jewish philosophers. That tremendous, of course, monumental dimension of this being. So that's another thing that one is impressed with, is the greatness. So we're just looking at different facets of the same being, how we will emphasize and will treasure that facet that is most meaningful to us. Now, of course, this, as I said, this being is the same as the Maitreya Buddha or the transfigured Christ, the cosmic Christ. That is, the whole idea of transfiguration is it is not limited to Jesus, the man who lived at a certain time and place, but to the eternal and cosmic Christ. And of course, one has also the same thing in for example, the vision that is recorded in the Bhagavad Gita. It's again, of course, it's a vision of the being of splendor, as seen from the eyes of a human with his limitations, her limitations. And the same thing, of course, with the vision of Ezekiel, where perhaps you are familiar with that. It's the first chapter of Ezekiel, and in fact it's the very basis of the cosmic celebration. The being that he saw was what they call Metatron. That is, as let's say, it's the immanent aspect of God, as concrete as one could possibly imagine it, but of course it is much less concrete than one could ever imagine. And you remember, it was he was trying to describe the splendor of this being that was so overwhelmingly brilliant that, of course, actually that he was only able to describe the splendor of the wheels of the chariot in Chrysol, if I remember, in terms of jewels, of course, because they radiated so much light. And of course he never saw the being himself, at least he never claimed to have seen the being, but simply the bottom of the robe, as to give an idea of the immensity of that being and the inability of man of the human being ever to have any, the slightest ability of encompassing all the bounty of that being. So we can never, of course, encompass it completely, but partially, and of course that's very inspiring. So we've been talking about two things. One is the radiance, and that expresses, how can I say, is experienced as light, but we know that, as we did this morning, that the light is just a concrete expression of the splendor, which can never be limited to any form, any feature, like countenance beyond the face. And perhaps you know that the wheels are epitomized by the galaxies, and for the Hechaloth of the Jews, the galaxies are bodies of the Galganim, a certain level of archangel, Galganim, and the Ophanim. For their bodies are spirals of light. So that was a vision of the wheels of the chariot. From that you can imagine the immensity of the being. And of course all of this is figurative, because of course there's no limit to immensity of the being of splendor. It's not a being, it's like the composite being that forms the essence of all being. That's really what it is, and that's what one means by the cosmic Christ. So it's not a being who is liable to birth and death and evil and failure and all that. But you see, the beautiful thing about this is that it helps us to idealize, to make a little more precise in our minds the ultimate objective of our being, because that's what it is. It's like at the end of the horizon, so it's beyond the horizon, let's say, but somehow the prime motivation behind us is a kind of intuitive grasp of the divine perfection, tangible, not just intelligence and spirit, but tangible and splendor. That's much more closer to us. Immensity. You know how a tree can grow to its maturity? Animals too. There are certain animals you feel have just reached their maturity. And so we as humans, we can say that we are in the process of growth, and I think very few of us can ever say that we have reached a state of maturity, which is a good thing, because then we know that there's still room for growth. So this idea of greatness, of grandeur, represents that point of maturity. We somehow, when I think it's not just pure metaphor when I speak about a great being, and it sounds a little bit judgmental to say a puny being, but somehow I think it's true that you can say that there's that little man there rushing about the streets of New York who's, well, he's really, I mean, everything is relative, of course, but as compared with that great being there who is, there are people who just give one sense of having grown tremendously to a cosmic stature. You find them in positions of sometimes even in business, or professor, or someone that's your doctor, or who has attained a certain amount of maturity. And so that's related to this idea of greatness. Now, while I talk about these things, maybe I should, because these are different aspects of the being of splendor, maybe I should refer to the wazifa, to the attribute corresponding to it. First of all, pure intelligence, so which is not, as we've already said, the wisdom that one derives from what I call the input processing of information is being built up. So, but the original, the proto-critic understanding, that is called aqil. The Arabs generally write it with just QL. There's no I between them, aqil. But I suppose in the European transliteration one would write an E or an I. I don't know which. Depends what method of transliteration one uses. And of course, pure spirit is Kudus. Now, what this Ananda is, this pure ecstasy, it's not a wazifa, as far as I know. The word used in Sufism is al-ghaib, which means, bewilderment or something like that. It's very high state, in al-ghaib. It's translated exactly by the consternation of intelligence. Isn't that a wonderful word? Consternation of intelligence. And it's shattered by the glory. So when we speak about the splendor, the word that is used is azim, and that's the word that the dervishes are always using when they greet each other. They say, Ya Azim, which means, how splendidly does God manifest to me through you. Now, then we spoke about another thing, which is the grandeur. The grandeur. The enormity, the vastness, of course. And the word for that is Aziz. So you have Azim and Aziz. And I often compare it with the Gloria and the Magnificat. The Gloria is being in ecstasy, being aware of the splendor, and Magnificat, to magnify, that just says it, you see, the greatness. Aziz. It's very curious, of course, that in the Arabic language, the word Aziz means both grandeur and a kind of term of endearment. Aziz mian, says. But I suppose it's, I think like a big dog, can be very endearing. So one says that to one's big uncle, who's when was a little child, and one likes one's big uncle. So he's a dear uncle. Aziz, says Aziz. So this, I think that this aspect of the being of splendor is something that we begin to grasp when we go into the cosmic dimension of consciousness. When we extend our consciousness, or rather, let our consciousness be dissolved or be resorbed in the vastness, then we get this idea of greatness. I always think it's epitomized by these words of Poincaré, who was a French mathematician, Henri Poincaré, I think, and I always used to make a mistake about it. It was his brother who was the president of the Republic. He was a great mathematician. And he says, infinity is inherent no, let's say the human mind carries the same features as nature, and even as nature does exhibit infinity and eternity, in the same way the human mind is able to grasp infinity and eternity. And one example of it is that you can always imagine a larger number than the largest number that you've imagined so far. So it is what he calls infinity is infinity in the mind of the human is the ability of the mind to always continue adding a number to any number. There's no reason to stop anywhere. But it gives you a grasp of what I mean by the cosmic dimension. And of course, the same thing is true, like there's always an earlier time than the earliest time that one can imagine, and a further time. And I know that in the old days, of course, one used to think that beyond the furthest star there was, well, there must be some other star. And if there's not some other star, then what is there? Like, is there just empty space? And then how far does it go? And it can't stop anywhere because, of course, somehow our mind does carry within it the propensity to think in terms of infinity. Now, of course, we know that the universe is curved, that space is curved upon itself, and then, of course, we don't quite understand then what would be beyond this curvature. But then, of course, our concepts of space are limited, of course. But nowadays, of course, people like Penrose, for example, in London, in England, is beginning to, well, of course, many mathematicians have done that before, is beginning to explore new ways of looking upon space. But anyway, whatever the ways that one looks upon space, somehow the human mind, as I say, being the analog of nature, has the ability to always imagine something vaster than anything that is imagined so far, or something more perfect. So I think that's Aziz, the unending ability to grasp grandeur and greatness. And there's no end to that greatness. And when you think that way, it makes you great. Think small thoughts makes you small. That's why I keep on speaking about freeing oneself from the limitation of the personal vantage point, because that keeps one small. And also, in the act of worship, there's magnanimity, isn't there? There's a sense of, there's room for someone greater than me. Like, instead of I'm the greatest. So there we have a feature of the being of splendor that is very important. Now, the word that is used to denote the being of splendor is Jalal wal-Ikram. Azim is, of course, is glorification. But it is true that Ikram is a still higher, denotes something still higher than Azim. Ikram denotes splendor. It is the word for splendor, being of splendor, Ikram. You remember what we were saying, that it's like light is kind of tangible, but splendor is that which can transpire as light. And the word that I use then is Zahir. Zahir means the manifestation. Actually, the best translation of Zahir is Epiphany. The Epiphany of splendor. Epiphany means where splendor manifests as light. That's the meaning of Epiphany. And so we have a natural sequence there between Ikram and Zahir. Ya Ikram, Ya Zahir. You can say that. Ya Ikram, Ya Zahir. Whereas Jalal, of course, means majestic. And of course, that's a more tangible feature of splendor. Confers upon a being a majesty. So I think it's perfectly legitimate to feel the whole forward thrust of Zahir, of the Epiphany, the manifestation, aiming at showing forth, at unfolding the hidden treasure, the potentialities in us that have not yet manifested. The word that is used, a very beautiful word, is releasing these potentialities from the solitude of unknowing. I would have said the solitude of unknowing and also the solitude of not being actuated. Because there are always two aspects, knowing and unfolding. So it's like all of that in our being is striving to come through. And we are ourselves the obstacles to this coming through. And in many ways, perhaps we don't have the courage to be what we are. As I said, like, you remember what I said about the artist, the actor. The great actor is one who has the courage to manifest qualities in him herself on the stage which her would not be manifesting in real life. It's just a situation which encourages one to affirm aspects of oneself that one would not be affirming in ordinary life, for the simple reason that, as soon as you stick your head out, you get a big bang on the head. So one learns to be rather modest. It's a safer way of going about things. Sounds like an ego trip. The great actor is one who has the courage, in the name of spirituality, to show forth all the beauty of God. And that comes through very beautifully in the words of Abu Yazid Bastami, who was concentrating on Dul Jalal Bal-Ikram for years. I mean, having gone through the fana, I mean, the absolute annihilation of his being, to the point when he said, I went through the naughting of nothingness and the naughting of nothingness, like the absolute fana, till there was nothing remaining. And then God called me and said, show yourself forth, because my people want to see me. And he said, adorn me with thy qualities, and unify me in thy oneness, and invest me with thy I-ness, so that when people come to see thee, they should only see thee, and I should not be there. The whole idea about it was, of course, that the purpose of man is to show forth the divine qualities. And that is the only justification in doing the wazifas. So it's a much better way than to think, well, I'm doing a wazifa because I'm trying to develop a certain quality. No. I'm doing a wazifa because I feel part of that urge of the divine being to epiphanize him herself, that is Zahir, the epiphany, the manifestation of the divine qualities which were batin, which were veiled. Batin is the opposite of Zahir, which were veiled, that is the unknown treasure that desired to be known. One can use the word bounty. I like to use the word bounty instead of treasure. There's a bounty behind all of it, and it's a terrible shame if this bounty doesn't come through. Like when a person has a talent and they're not using their talent, one thinks, what a waste of a good life. They had all this talent. So that's the fana. But what I'm saying is, we have to be very careful with our interpretation of what was a genuine inspiration, or when you use the word revelation sometimes. You see, all of this spiritual stuff is, it all started by real genuine experience of beings who, let's say, reached beyond the middle ranges of experience. And very often those beings themselves were interpreting what they experienced in terms of the ordinary thinking that they were brought up in. And of course, much worse, of course, people are interpreting what they experienced and then, of course, really limiting it to their concepts. And that's why one of the most dangerous things is to go by, books on spirituality, because they're extremely misleading, but it's mostly written by people who haven't had the experience themselves. People who have the experience rarely write books. These days, of course, things are changing a little bit, but of course in the old days, of course, a rishi would never write a book, or a mushi would never write a book. Now, our Murshid, Hazrat Inayat Khan, he did, most of the things we have are just lectures, but they weren't his own, let's say he didn't write them, except with the exception of the Gayan Padnirtan, which were just sayings that he wrote occasionally. Anyway, what I'm saying is that we have to be very careful about the way the mind categorizes a live experience. So then we think in terms of fana, that is, my ego has to go so that only the God consciousness comes through. That's a very limited way of thinking. That's not the holistic way of thinking. No. The whole person includes the divine dimensions and the human ones, just like this pyramid that's upside down that I keep on talking about. So it doesn't eliminate the ego, it just relates the ego to the total thing instead of just having this contrast, you see. The best thing you could say is that there is a shift in emphasis from the personal vantage point to an overall. Perhaps not even that. Even that is not the latest, the ultimate. No, I think it is the convergence of the totality in the ego. That's much more important than the de-emphasis against the ego towards the totality. That would be samadhi, you see, with a certain remnant of the ego. No, I think the opposite is better. It's not like Buddha says, like you watch the way things look from your personal vantage point and you decide that it's wrong because you're caught in illusion. No, it is illuminating the personal vantage point with the breadth and breadth and depth or high altitude of the total consciousness. And like a kind of elasticity, if you like, of the personal eye that is able to encompass more and more greatness. It's a much better way of looking at things. So then what I'm saying is that somehow we are motivated by the forward thrust of evolution in us, seeking to unfold all the hidden treasure in us, the bounty. I say in us, but it's like it's open-ended, so that pyramid that I'm talking about is open-ended. That is, at the bottom there's a point, definite, so it's got frontier, let's say, the bottom, but the other end is open. That's like a wave is open-ended, isn't it? There's an outline somewhere, but there's no boundary between the wave and the sea. It's open-ended. Okay, so that I would like us to keep that very much in mind all the time, because from that moment one does not have this feeling, well, me, I'm imperfect and I'm trying to get better, and then there's the divine being up there and I'm trying to reflect something of the divine being. That's the old way in which we used to think. Now we have to think, no, I include everything. I include the divine being. Everything is, the word me doesn't mean just that little fraction that I like to contrast with the totality. I'm thinking in terms of the whole person. And so the question is now, from the moment that I can see that, it makes it easier for me to actuate those higher qualities, let's say, that I did not have the courage to claim to be my qualities. You see, because one had made this dichotomy between this artificial categorizing between oneself and God. What I'm saying is then that you are the being of splendor. That's what I'm saying. Ultimately. Instead of thinking, projecting it as an image up there that I'm trying to reach, a being who is up there somewhere, realizing that one carries all the features of that being in one, and all that one has to do is have the courage to realize that one is it. That's the story of the initiate who, Suravadi, who was advancing in these landscapes of the soul and came across this being, magnificent being, and finally realized that it was his own self. That's the whole story. And another Sufi story. This is really Sufism, the essence of Sufism. The other story is the story of the language of the birds. You know that the hoopoe, the king of the birds, assembled a lot of birds for a big conference, and they decided that they'd like to go and visit the king. And so they went through masses of them, mass of birds, enormous migration, left and went through the deserts and parts of the land that were flooded, and, well, millions of them died. I don't know whether millions is correct, or thousands, I'm not sure. It doesn't really matter. But only 8 remained. Why 8, I'm not quite sure. But and when they knocked at the door of the palace, the chamberlain said, "What do you want?" They said, "Well, we've come all this way to visit the king." He said, "Oh, do you think that our splendid king has time to see you, motley lot?" Oh. So they said, "But we've come all this way, and most of us have died, and you would ever think of what we've gone through? Do you mean to say the king would refuse to see us after all this? Come and wait in the palace room and see, the throne room." And they waited and waited and waited, and nothing happened. And the king of the birds thought to himself, well, it was a rather naughty thought, actually. He thought, well, how about sitting on the throne? I did that, in the Vatican. I sat on the throne of the Pope. And it was a very naughty thought, but, I've been kept waiting so long. So I understand those birds. And then when they sat on the throne, they realized that they were the beings whom they had been searching for. That's the whole story. So there's all these people searching for God up there, not realizing that they are God themselves. That's the whole story. That's why Nifari says, why do you look for God up there? He is here. So it's good to have this projection of the being of splendor that is just actually, I don't know whether you may have had a kind of vision of an archangel. Maybe, each one will see according to his capacity of seeing, of course. But somehow, I'm sure that you've had a vision of a being who is just so, let's say, 1,000,000 times more wonderful than any being that one has ever met in real life. And so, of course, something is gained by this encounter with someone other than how one thinks oneself to be. I was going to say other than oneself. No, that's not true, because one is that wonderful oneself, but one doesn't realize it. So how one conceives of oneself is easier, of course, to project and see this encounter, this being who's so magnificent. And then all the envisioning that one has of what perfection could be is projected in a semi-tangible way, let's say. And the impression, of course, that one gets is of course, the cosmicity of that being that is not, like, limited. Like it would need the vastness of space to move about in. Like it wouldn't be able to move on the planet. It would be too small, too confining. It's that sense of that's the vastness. So that's again an impression that one gets of the being of splendor that having come across is that being is evanescent. It's an aspect which I will try to clarify a little more. Like, for example, the Upanishad says, it has passed before one has noticed that it was there. It's a very wonderful way of saying it. If one were to try and fix it with one's grasp, it would flee from one's grasp, like the bluebird of Maeterlinck. There's no way of holding it. You try to grasp it, it will escape your grasp. If you remember that story of Maeterlinck, then if you don't try to grasp it, then it follows you. But then you don't know it because it's behind you. But that's the evanescent quality of the being of splendor. And it's described, it's epitomized actually in the Indian mythology as Narada. I don't know whether you know who's Narada. Narada is, I suppose it's the equivalent of Khidr. I think it's the equivalent of Khidr and of Elijah. And Narada appears when one is lost, like Khidr appears when lost in the desert. When one has abandoned the chance of survival, some people get that vision of the angel when they're just at that moment of crisis. When one does not know where to turn, what to do, where to go, there's no path. And Narada is very often associated with the wind. He comes just before you, when you don't expect it, and has gone before you notice it. Which, of course, it denotes the uncanny nature of splendor, because splendor can never be reduced to the forms which epiphanize it. It's always beyond them, and that's why we use that word, that which transpires behind that which appears. And again, another way of describing it is, or I don't know how to say it, of approaching it, is the idea of ubiquity, like Baba, that Hindu guru who is supposed to, one saw him here and one saw him there at the same time. It's Harijan Baba is his real name, that was described by Yogananda, I think. Babaji, yes, Babaji. People go very much by that picture, in the book, but the picture's all wrong. One can live on a myth. But if you see the picture of Harijan Baba, of course, he was the one that they were referring to. And he was said to appear mysteriously in one place and another place. It's a kind of a thing that you find in a lot of the legends of the of whether Sufis or Hindus or others, of course. It's one what they call the quality of the rose. The rose is one of the ranks in the hierarchy of masters. If you read the book, the Unity of Religious Ideas of Murshid, and under the paragraph hierarchy, Murshid speaks about the 5 different ranks in the hierarchy. The first one is Buzurg, I think, and then there's the Wali, and then there's the Rose, and then there's the Kutub. And so the Kutub is like it means the pole. So there's generally only one on the planet. And then the rose is the second one under that. And the quality of the rose is that he, or she of course, is always, can duplicate himself for herself, like Osiris, for example, in Egypt, the same idea. So I'll have to leave it at that for the time being. We'll continue tomorrow.